A lot of people think, I won't mention administration, think that our faculty sit around and read books. There's nothing wrong with reading, but they do a lot more. And it's these kind of topics that are being presented that we hope you'll find of interest and illuminating. And now you know where they are, and when you need information, you know whom to contact. I'll go right ahead to the introductions and tell you how this is going to work. We're going to start with a presentation by a visitor. He's on sabbatical from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. This is Dr. Jesus Adrián Escudero, and he's a professor of continental philosophy at that university. He's been a visiting professor and lecturer at the universities of Münster in Germany, and in Italy, Milano, Padova, and Torino, as well as an invited speaker at international conferences in Europe and South America. He's translated and edited several books from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And he's also written a lot of books about Heidegger, not just editing. He belongs to several international editorial boards, and this is interesting, especially interesting, I think. He's an advisor to the Scientific Committee of the Spanish and Portuguese Department of Science and Higher Education. Now, Jaime, Dr. Fadas, who teaches in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, has given me a much longer introduction. I'll see you. Jaime is assistant professor of the practice and director of Bachelor of Arts in Translation and Interpretation, Legal and Healthcare concentrations. This is a BA that's offered jointly by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and also by the Mexican American Studies Department. And we have one of the students right in here. He's a researcher with the National Center for Interpretation, Testing, Research, and Policy. Did you know this institute existed here at the University of Arizona? Okay. He's a certified interpreter and translator for the United States District Court. He's a medical interpreter and a translator accredited by the American Translators Association. He's taught translation and interpretation at the School for Professional Studies at Boston University and at Bentley College. He's taught music and Spanish language and culture at Tufts and at the University of Massachusetts Boston. He's also had stints as staff translator and editor for school and college divisions of Houghton Mifflin Publishing, Prentice Hall, Simon & Schuster. Done lots of translations. Recent translations include the book El Estudio de la Orquestación, The Study of Orchestration, by the Juilliard School of Music and London Publishing. I think I'll stop there. These two gentlemen will speak first, and later on they'll be joined by two, we're calling them practitioners, and I put down my notes, but Zelda Harris, there they are up there. As you see, someone from the Rogers School of Law, and a doctor from the College of Medicine. So they'll join us later after we finish working. So we'll get started with this one.
Thank you very much, Pat. Pat is just fantastic. She's such a mistress of ceremonies. Sorry. She's
yes. That's a relay and it takes a couple of seconds. So thank you very much to Pat. Pat is just phenomenal. He's a good friend, best presenter we can have, and she's been very helpful putting all this together. The first thing that I want to say is that we are very grateful to the College of Humanities and to the staff at the Poetry Center who works very hard in order to make this such a beautiful room. They have been hosting a number of activities this week, so they've been working very long hours non-stop. I know that because I was here yesterday and they were just holding chairs, so they not only stay on top of things intellectually, but they also do all the physical labor and logistics necessary so we can come here and do our presentation. Thank you very, very, very much. I also want to thank you all for showing up. This is a very good turnout. I see many of our students in the program here, colleagues, fellow professors and colleagues. I understand that there are some people from Pima Community College here too, so welcome to all. This is heartwarming. And I just would like to tell you something about today's program. This is what we have in store for you. Jesus is going to give a presentation basically talking about the topics that you see up there. He's an accomplished lecturer and a master philosopher, so I'm sure that you will enjoy very much what he has to say about the ethics of translation and the hermeneutics of translation. And I will follow up with some commentary on ethics, the law from my perspective as a user, a provider, a professional, and an educator. And then we will have Professor Harris from the College of Law, who is the director of the Clinical Services Domestic Violence Clinic and also teaches a class on ethics, and Dr. Francisco Moreno, who is a psychiatrist, who will be coming later. Hopefully they are very busy, but they thought that this was a very interesting opportunity to share their experiences with the community, so they will spend 10 or 15 minutes with us just talking about their personal experience as providers of clinical services. And without any further ado, I will leave you with my colleague Jesus Adrian and his talk. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Thanks for the invitation to the Humanities Weeks. Actually, it's pretty funny that I had to speak about translation because I had to ask for some help for Jaime to help me to translate and correct my text. Believe it or not, it's going to be my first talk in English in the United States. I've done different talks in Germany, in Italy, Portugal, and whatever. So my first language, as you can imagine, is Spanish. Catalan is used in Catalonia. It's like if you speak English in French Canadian. Then getting to my academic career, I had to go to Germany, so I learned German. And now that's a difficult process in itself, plus translating books from German. Then I started giving lessons outside of Spain. I was in Italy for a few times, so I had to learn some Italian, but I can speak and understand pretty well. And not enough, I have to learn to read some French and Portuguese just to read the research about my field, you know. So now I'm here, 45, getting white-haired, and now in the process of learning American English. So it's another challenge for me. So the only thing I can ask for you is a little bit of passion. Don't make some mistakes, please forgive me. And as we say in philosophy, apply the principle of the hermeneutic charity. Okay? Make the best effort to try to understand. I try to do the best on myself. The text, as all we academics used to do, is pretty long. It's too long, it's over 20 pages. You know, you start writing and you're in a little studio and you forget about the people that has to hear you. Don't worry, I've been advised to not to speak more than 25 to 30 minutes. Jaime is a good referee, is going to show me when I have the last 5 minutes to finish my speech. So I'm going to jump over a lot of your things, but don't worry. After the talk, if you come to me, you give me your email address, I would send you the text through email without any problem. If this is the case, you know, with all the footnotes and all this academic stuff, it's normally boring in a talk like today. So let's me then start with the general introduction. So it's a fact that we live in a new global society, integrated by an enormous diversity of cultures and languages. It's pretty obvious when you come to the Southwest. Not only about the Mexican, if I go to California, or you just walk through the airports, terminals where I live or spend a lot of time, Atlanta, New York, Lima, Buenos Aires, City of Mexico, you just have to walk around. It's not only the image, you just listen to a whole bunch of different languages. And if you don't travel that much, don't worry, you just have to walk inside a hospital waiting room in our own town, in our own district, and you will see and listen in immediately how different languages are spoken in the same room and in the same space. But the important thing, it's not only a question of communication. It's basic. It's a lot of time a question of survival and of legal right for those people that don't speak the official languages. So in this global society, it is always told on TV if you watch the news, is essentially multicultural and multilingual. And we have to find a solution to deal with this new reality or with this problem. How? This is the point we are going later. It's basically developing different tools to provide a fluid communication between different cultural groups. In our case, in our example, basically in the areas of the hospitals, the courtrooms, and we could also bring it on the areas of schools. And this is often a question to warranting equal access to fundamental rights. It's not only a question to go to the groceries and know how to buy a thing. We speak about fundamental rights like healthcare, justice, and education. So one of the core values of the American society and of the Western civilized societies. So in such context, translation plays a fundamental role, bridging the gap between different languages and different cultural values. But in opposition to the translation of secret text or scientific text, as I think we academic guys do in our home, translating philosophical text in my case, or poetry or religious texts. In the case of oral translation, what technically is called interpretation, he is a good example of it, and he is going to speak about it. In this case, we are dealing with people, face to face. And obviously, this raises immediately the ethical questions of how to treat these people with the dignity and respect that we all deserve, like human beings. So from this point of view, we would like to bring attention to some aspects of the test of translation and interpretation. As Jaime has pointed out, on the one hand, it's going to go further in this point, the importance of the translation services in courtrooms and hospitals. And on the other end, this is the part I'm going to develop, is more the philosophical and more the historical background of the function and nature of translation and the ethical demands that the translation brings with it. At the end, we have to rethink again the core values of our democracy. If the United States of America is committed to the provision of equal access and respectful treatment of people, this must be preserved in order to provide equal access to any person entitled to it. So let us start, this is the part I'm going to do, with this historical background and giving some philosophical remarks about the very nature of translation. In antiquity, interpreters were essential in trade and state matters. Remember Egyptian society, for example, or Greek society, all the people making commerce over Greece. While in the same time, translators, that's the difference, transfer and pass on the later generations the documents that were to form the canon of what we have today. It's the literature, philosophy, history, economy, medicine, or whatever text you want to remind right now. So how have ideas, cultural values, religious belief, moral precepts, artistic concept, or scientific knowledge moved from one place to another? Pretty easy question, no? But sometimes we don't make easy questions, we don't take it for granted. Without ignoring or without underestimating oral tradition, what's very important, basically in South America and Central America, we have to agree that written texts are the basic source of knowledge transmission. Just look around our libraries that we have all around. In this sense, translation has played historically a fundamental role by making available human knowledge between different languages across the time. Think, for example, in different example of the Bible, Confucius' religion, Greek philosophy, history, or tragedy, one thing that I like a lot, obviously, legal and moral texts in Latin, Arabic medicine, medieval theology, modern science, the ideals of enlightenment, or the values of democracy. They have spread from country to country, generation after generation, thanks to translations by anonymous translators that we always forget. But without this task of translation, we wouldn't have these texts now at our disposal. That means that translation has played a big and frequently underestimated function in accumulating an immense cultural heritage. One does well to remember that most of us, and I will say that if not all of us, have read the best-known works of Western literature in translations, unless you read Greek, Latin, Hebraic, French, Italian, Chinese, Indian, or English if you're living in Europe. That's not the case. Only 0.1% would do it. Leonardo da Vinci, genius like this. Normal people like us need the translations. Just remember names, very well known, like Sophocles, Euripides, Augustinus, Boccaccio, Thomas Mann, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Dostoevsky, and so on. So translation has always been a basic instrument in the formation of thinking and of writing in every European language, and for that matter, almost in every language and culture in the world. And I know a lot of people are going to tell me this is a Eurocentric point of view. Yes, and I'll accept it. But basically, even Indian literature was inspired first by the models of European language and literature. And when I say European, I don't mean it in a geographical sense, obviously. I mean it more in a cultural and economic sense. Even in present days, translation is still of the utmost importance in a world technologically interconnected and economically interdependent, which enhances international relations between individuals, communities, organizations, governments, small and big corporations. And just put it in the reality of my daily teaching with my students, 10 years ago, none of them wanted to learn English. Now that all are on Facebook and have friends overseas, all starting to learn English, watching movies in English. In this sense, globalized society brings all they need to learn another language in the old one. You Americans have it pretty easy with the English right now, in the 20th century. In the 15th century, without Latin, you were pretty lost. In this sense, you are pretty lucky that you don't have to learn a second language, but it's very useful to know a second one. But today, with the global connected society, with America, you can go wherever you want. And if you have a good visa card, it's pretty much easy. My wife is American. She wants to go Italy, make some shopping. No clue of Italian, just smiling, shows the credit card. It's going to be fun. Explain with the American. They make really the effort to understand the basic English. So the increasingly expansion, development, and transmission of information in a global scale through science, media, entertainment, and commerce just reveals more clearly the problem of translation. That's a real issue, believe it or not. Many see the possible solution to adopt English like a global language, but from my point of view, the cultural diversity is pretty much unconceivable in just one single global language. So you have to preserve the diversity. In fact, the rise of debates about national identity should be seen as an evidence of the fact of globalization. What we have here is normally a defense response to a growing awareness of an increasing global connectivity, both physical and cultural, which is deeply affecting established notions and values of place. The result of this globalization, and we have this conservative movement that wants to preserve the English, wants to preserve the Spanish, wants to preserve the Catalan, wants to preserve the French. You have all these cultural governmental programs in Spain, we have a few of them in the Catalan government. In French, you have all. For example, 60% of the content of radio has to be in French, not in another language, just to preserve the language, the linguistic identity. It's a good job, but you cannot look to the global ethics and the global reality of where we really live. In this globalization, we all have to look around our different places where we come, in different language there we speak. This is provoking a displacement, or if you want, a disembedding of local ways of doing things. And in the end, not only changing the very substance of our neighborhoods and public space, but also changing the images that we have of politics and the state. So the conditions in which we live now have changed. We cannot like it, but it's a fact that the conditions have changed. To the point where localized forms of belonging, like neighborhood, region, class, state, citizenship, have become much more open and ambiguous, and partially displaced by more globally mediated ones. Through leisure and lifestyle, shopping online is a pretty good example. Taste and consumption, media and tourism. It could be virtual tourism and physical tourism. We all use the internet also to make a kind of tourism. In this sense, we are in this global arena, on this global scenario. At stake is the search for the new sources of existential trust and security. It's the search for new cultural, moral space. We have to refine our new moral precepts that we are using right now. In this multicultural and multilingual scenario, translation has begun to play a key role in supporting the globalization process and the exchange of all sorts of information through the use of internet. Moreover, translation has helped an unprecedented mass of people to travel as tourists, professionals, and workers. And I think I'm being in 3 categories right now. Who often have to, I live this same problem, settle down in a new country, learn the moral, language, prison, government, ethical principles, behavior. The turn between the urgent need to communicate. If you come here and you speak Spanish, okay, can help, it's not very useful. And if you have to go to immigration, as a Spanish guy with a visa, it's pretty tough, you don't speak a little bit English, make it easy, anyway. But on the other side is the wish to keep my own individuality in my own cultural background. So this is pretty stressy situation, but this is the reality I have to face. I cannot come and just speak Spanish, so I want to keep my historical background, my language, but I have to adapt to really where I'm living right now. So we should not be surprised then if translation is now central to debates about language and cultural identity. You guys go these lessons with Jaime know exactly about these problems. I'm not going this academic arena. It's too boring for the rest of the people. We could do it later with a coffee or beer after finishing this talk. So what is then the task and the nature of translation? The ancillary question of translation has often been summarized in the very famous Italian adagio, you all have heard about it, of traduttore traditore. The translator's traitor, no? Something like this. It's a very funny expression. In fact, the word translation can be related to the Latin tradere, what means to hand over, deliver, handing down knowledge, passing on a doctrine, if you want, surrender or betrayal. And I love etymologies, and you guys, if you go to school, go to the etymological dictionary. It's a very good tool for the field where you're working right now. So in the Latin word tradere, we have both senses, the one of transposition and at the same time the sense of betrayal. On the one hand, translation is not only a question of simply transcribing. It's easy if you're transcribing the manual of a computer, it's pretty easy, but if you're poetry, philosophy, or religion, you cannot just transcribe literally the same word. It's more an exercise of transposition. To put from one realm of language the sense to another side. Transponere, put from one place to the other. In this sense, the Germans, that I like a lot, they're very precise. They use the word Übersetzung. And this Übersetzung expresses pretty well the idea of crossing, of establishing a hermeneutic bridge between two linguistic constellations. On the other hand, the notion of betrayal is also very much part of the history of translation. And we all know a lot of mistakes that have been done in different translations, not only of the Bible. For an example, I can tell you philosophical books, German philosophical books translated in Spanish during our Civil War, pretty bad. Basically, it was done by a lot of academic people. They had to leave the country under the tyranny of Franco, and just for living, they have to translate. They were translating pages and pages and pages just to survive. But the quality of the philosophical translations are pretty bad, and sometimes even horrible, and sometimes a lot of mistakes. And if you work in academia, you go to the dean and say, oh my God, you can just write a book about the list of historical mistakes only done in the translation of philosophical books. So you manage what can happen on linguistics and other fields of knowledge. So in this sense, traduttore is a traditore in the different mechanisms of transforming or deforming the original text. One difficulty is that normally we are dealing with different mental pictures and different intellectual systems. And this is the part of the difficulty, or as Ortega and Gasset say, the misery of translating. And when you have to translate, you're going to feel this misery in your flesh. how can I translate this expression, this word, this metaphor, this image in my own language? It's a tough call, and you can spend a lot of time in looking to other translations in other languages, asking your colleagues, friends, and so on. But on the same time, and this is the best part, when you have finished your translation, the splendor of translation consists basically in manipulating and overcoming these difficulties. And you always find a way out. It can take you more or less, but at the end, you find it. So this manipulation or this overcoming, this facing these difficulties is forcing, really intellectually, sometimes even physically, 10 o'clock in the evening, you're absolutely tired, but you have to deliver the translation to the publisher the weekend, so it's even physically. Coffee doesn't help anymore, but you have to do it. It forces the translator and the reader to move within, and this within is very difficult, the linguistic habits of the foreign language. And I've done this experience. I start speaking the foreign language, translating simultaneously from the Spanish to the vocabulary up in English or in German, and slowly I start thinking in the own language. It's a process that you all have to learn. And you end up speaking the foreign language like your own one, with some difficulties, and you can evaluate it later. So in this sense, translating is useful in challenging the complexities of contemporary culture, because in the act of translating, we are forced to develop a sense of self-critique, of the limits of our own languages a lot of times. That is lacking in our scientific and pragmatic view of reality. That is, translation allows us to take critical distance of the ethnocentric structure of our own culture. When you're translating from German to Spanish, the cultural distance is not that big. But when you're translating from Indian to Spanish or Chinese from Spanish, then you can see the big gap. And then you see the cultural difference and the gap that you have to jump over. And you take, or you be aware of your own Eurocentric values. And this is, in the act of translation, you have to deal with this problem. I'm going to jump a few little details, more academic. If you go to different theories of translations, we will normally see you have to deal with three big risks. One is ethnocentrism. The other is hypertextualism, a very technical word. And the other very philosophical word is Platonism. And when you're translating or you're looking for translation, you have the ethnocentric translation. We're just putting in place your own cultural values, pretty obvious. The opposite of ethnocentric translation is hypertextual. It's very common, where you translate it by imitation, parody, transforming, adaptation, transformation of the original text in something absolutely different. It's a lot of translations that are done in this way. And we have then this Platonic translation, like philosopher like this expression, is the pursuit of a pure, ideal, and universal sense. So people think that behind the diversity of language, behind this diversity is a common universal logos that put all languages together. It's the inverse of Babel. From the diversity you can go back to the main source. It's a kind of Platonic translation. In the context of our talk, obviously out of the academic room, we have to put some attention of the risks of ethnocentrism. I think this is pretty clear in this multicultural atmosphere where we are living right now. This risk of ethnocentrism, we can detect them, we can play in two different levels. By one level, it's a critical level where we have to detect the forces that deform a text during the process of translation. And if you have translated from American to Spanish, or Spanish to English, to French and not speak the English, you see how on the translation you can transform the meaning from the original. And this is only in the colloquial speech. But if you do it with the scientific text or legal text, you can run some risks. And if it's the notary with the will of your parents, maybe you're losing what they gave to you. So be accurately and detect the process of deforming the text. But at the same time, we have to think in a constructive point of view. We have to develop an ethics of translation and interpretation. I'm not going to say anything about the analytic of translation. It's very boring. A lot of different issues we can go later in if you want during the talk and a round of questions. The task of analytics has to be complemented with an ethics of translation. As you know, all translation has to deal with the old dilemma of being faithful to the original. In this what do? Do I sacrifice their own language, or do I respect people's own language? This is the eternal dilemma we are translators live in. There's a German philosopher from the 19th century, from the Romantic movement, and you know, German Romanticism was one of the most important phase in the history of ideas of translating effort. You know, the Hölderlin, Herder, Schlegel, Goethe, the brothers Grimm, and so on, words that you probably don't know, but they're very important history of translation. There was a guy, Humboldt, a guy that was traveling a lot around the world and a very good diplomat. He found a very nice solution. He quoted, the translated text may show some tending to favor the foreign language, you have to respect it, but without producing the impression of total foreignness. In translation of philosophical texts, this happens a lot of times. So you have to try apply this principle of balance. It's not really easy. Anyway, to shorten up a little bit, and the ethical act of translating consists in finding and receiving the other in itself, without imposing, and this is something difficult, any prejudice, and letting it speak in his or her own language. So, summarizing, the nature of translation is basically dialogue and openness. So when you're translating, you have to be open to the other that speaks another language and that probably shares different cultural values. In fact, in the act of translation, we are in front of a mutual influence and reciprocal intercultural exchange that's very rich to rejuvenate and to enrich both languages, the own one and the foreign. So don't be afraid, integrate it in this kind of open dialogue. And this, having this general background, philosophical and historical background in mind, we can go now and focus just a little bit in what would be the core values that should inform a code of ethics in translation and interpretation. Basically, and this is what my friend Jaime is going to develop, in the areas of the courtrooms and the hospital. So from the earliest times of mankind, human beings have defined rules of conduct. We all know them, from the family, from the community, from the state, or the society where we belong. And these shared rules and governing principles of right and wrong have become formalized in different ways. You know, cultures embody these values and norms and customs, religion and moral precepts, governments and the laws, and professions, translation, attorney, and whatever, in the codes of ethics. So here it's interesting to identify a few of these core values, not what's going to inform what we call technically the ontological codes of professions like medicine, law, education, and journalism. And don't forget that ethics come from the Greek ethos, meaning moral custom, habit, or character. So develop an ethic attitude is develop the habit to be good, not doing the wrong. So in the repetition of the performing of the own profession, different profession areas have developed their own ethical values to perform their duties and obligations. And I think each profession is tied to rules and principles of their respective professional communities. Journalists have one, lawyers have one, doctors, nurses, even professors have one. The best known is the Hippocratic Oath, where we don't have to go in many details. So why are codes of ethics really necessary? Basically, these ethical codes provide guidelines, give general orientations for making reasonable judgments in a given context or in a particular relation. And I tell you, it's guidelines orientation. It's not a norm. It helps you how to orientate and what to do. What is the function? Basically, to define procedures and acceptable behaviors, to promote high standards of professionalism, to improve professional skills, and to establish a sense of responsibility. In the area of interpreting in a cross-cultural society like ours, we have to pay attention to different core values that should be present in the code of ethics in the area of interpretation. Just to finishing with the last 1 minute and 20 seconds I'm able, this is like in the fourth quarter of the 7-match play of the NBA. So I have the ball, or put it in, or we lose the game, the championship. So now I have 1 minute, I'm going to make a good use of it, and give you just the list of these different values that we should take in account. Obviously, one of them is accuracy, to render the message accurately and completely. Impartiality, the interpreter does not allow personal judgments or cultural bias to influence objectivity. Tough call, a lot of times. Confidentiality, to honor and protect the privacy of the patient. Respect, to acknowledge the inherent dignity of all parties involved in the encounter. Cultural awareness, to facilitate communication across cultural difference. Professionalism, to be honest and ethical in all business practices. And beneficence, the essential obligation and duty to support the health and well-being of the patient and her or his family and community. Don't write it down. If you want to send it by email, the text is much easier, and you don't have to break your hand writing down. So thanks a lot for your attention, giving me the opportunity to share this reflection with you and remarks. Thanks, and give the word to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesus. As always, it's a pleasure to listen to your wisdom and to your expositions. What I guess that I will try to do next is to talk about ethical considerations for cross-cultural communicators, translators, and interpreters from my perspective as a member of society, a professional, and an educator. I am a practitioner. I have worked as a legal medical interpreter and translator for 15 years or so. I am a legal interpreter. I actually recently joined the cadre of federal interpreters here in District Court, Federal District Court, which some of my distinguished colleagues are here with us today. I also was a staff interpreter with the Trial Court of Massachusetts for several years, supervising and providing interpretation services in Superior Court, Juvenile Court. I also was a supervisor of interpreter operations at a large hospital. That was the Brigham and Women's Hospital, that is the teaching hospital at Harvard in Boston, where I had to engage in the provision of interpretation services, medical, and also ran the service. So my beliefs are shaped by all these experiences, but first and foremost by the fact that I was a user of translation and interpretation services before being a provider. I can remember many anecdotes that happened to me personally. I remember, for instance, once when I went to Venezuela. Spanish is spoken in Venezuela, and I went to a restaurant and they were serving lagarto. Lagarto means lizard in Spanish, so I say, oh, I never had lizard. I want to get a piece of lizard. So they served me a piece of lagarto, and then I say, oh, this tastes pretty much like beef. And then the guy told me, what do you mean pretty much like beef? This is beef. And then I asked him, but you said that this is lagarto? And then he told me, yeah, lagarto, this is this piece in a cow, you know. So if you want to get sirloin in Venezuela, you have to ask for lagarto. Or I remember once in Italy, I was by the coast and we were very hungry and wanted to get some fish. And we were looking at a menu and we saw pesce, pescado, pesce. So we ordered some pesce. And then a few minutes later, 3 peaches were served to us. We didn't think of the relationship with French, peach, pêche in French. But I remember, for instance, some of my students when they say that they are muy embarazados. It's a wrong cognate from Spanish, being embarrassed, especially problematic when the student is a male. So, but I do remember my first serious anecdote as somebody who needed translation and interpretation services happened at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid when I applied for my visa to come here to the United States for the first time. I went there with, we were a group of people. It's not a pleasant memory. I was there with a group of people and we were requesting visas to come to the United States, and a consular officer came to the window, one of those bulletproof thick metacrilato panels, and then she said, "Good morning. How would you like to conduct this proceeding, in English or in Spanish?" And then we look at ourselves and we say, "Well, we would like to do it in Spanish." And then she walked away, and we were just quite puzzled. So we waited. 10 minutes later, she came back and she said, "And now?" And then we said in English, and then we got through. But that hasn't been always the case. But I remember that when I arrived to the United States, I was 26 years old, came to study music, arguably the universal language, not like these languages that we speak, that you need translators and interpreters in order to make yourself understood. But I couldn't speak but a few words of English when I arrived here. I taught myself the language, still a work in progress, as you can see. I butcher the English language regularly, to my regret, but I love it dearly. But I taught myself the language out of necessity, and also because I wanted to learn about the history and culture of this country, and wanted to participate fully in society. I was already an adult, been supporting myself for 10 years already, which placed some pretty serious biological limitations to second language acquisition. Nonetheless, this informs my experience because I really can relate to people who are deprived of access. Because I remember how bad it felt to be excluded. Based on my experience, I believe that it is fundamental to discuss the societal implications that the lack of access has for people with limited English proficiency, especially in overly important fields like healthcare, justice, and education that Jesus has already mentioned in his talk. As we all know, effective communication between people, between clients and providers, is based on mutual understanding between the participants. In the healthcare field, a number of recently published studies and reports show that language and cultural barriers prevent meaningful access to healthcare for limited and non-English speaking people. And we also know that the lack of linguistic access has clinical consequences, diagnostic and treatment errors, questionable ethical practices among them, leading to unnecessary death in the most egregious cases. And these cases are not uncommon. The lack of qualified interpretation and translation services results in systematic health disparities and negative outcomes. Please take a look at this slide. This is a well-known, well-established fact, and there is consensus among professional organizations that represent interpreters, like the National Council for Interpreting in Healthcare, the California Health Interpreters Association, the International Medical Interpreters Association, which jointly represent thousands of interpreters and have code of ethics and professional conduct similar to those that Jesus mentioned in his talk. So there is consensus among the professional organizations that represent translators and interpreters. But this consensus actually reaches well beyond these organizations. For instance, the Office of Minority Health of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has issued guidelines under the Healthy People 2000, 2010, and 2020 initiatives to help agencies redress this problem. In March 2001, it published the National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services in Healthcare, a comprehensive implementation guide acknowledging the fact that the use of qualified translators and interpreters is fundamental to providing meaningful access. This slide that we are looking at lists some of the provisions that the recently passed so-called health care bill includes for language services for beneficiaries with limited English proficiency. The American Association of Medical Colleges and the American Medical Association have issued recommendations and requirements for the provision of cultural and linguistic services. Also, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations has published recommendations to address diversity and language and cross-cultural services. Medical residency programs increasingly view culturally competent medical students as better prepared and more competitive. So as I was saying before, the consensus about the need is not only among interpreters and translators, but generalized, which is good news indeed. Some states have passed laws requiring language services like California, Massachusetts, Washington State, Ohio, New York, and many health care organizations already provide those services, although we are still far from nationwide implementation. The latest push is for establishing a national certification program for medical interpreters, which I believe is very necessary to guarantee a national standard of quality. In Arizona, the situation is, well, not good. Way below minimum standards. We will have later today two practitioners, Professor Harris, who is already here with us, and hopefully Dr. Moreno too, that will be able to comment about their experience. They are very knowledgeable because they deal on a daily basis with people with limited English proficiency, so I think they will be very interesting to hear what they have to say. Now I would like to say a few words about the requirements for linguistic and cultural access in the legal setting. And again, Professor Harris is somebody who is much more knowledgeable than I am, but nonetheless I brought a few notes here that I would like to share with you. The federal government and the judiciary, as well as most states, recognize equal access and meaningful participation under conditions which satisfy the requirements of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. For instance, the Sixth Amendment rights to understand charges brought against an individual and the right to meaningful participation in criminal processes, and also through federal laws that were published in the 60s after the fight for civil rights, such as Title VI. Title VI, in its section about public health and welfare, and this is very important, includes an explicit prohibition of exclusion from participation of people with limited English proficiency. This reflects the now widely accepted view, reinforced by decisions from the Supreme Court, like in Lau versus Nichols, and if I have time I'll talk more about that later, that language and national or regional origin are so closely intertwined that language-based discrimination is effectively an excuse for national origin or ethnic discrimination. There is also President Clinton's Executive Order 13166. Executive Order 13166, signed by President Clinton in the year 2000 and still in full force, took Title VI a step further. The order requires all federal agencies to promulgate regulations and guidance for their financial assistance recipients regarding the provision not only of services to individuals with limited English proficiency, but also of programs and activities designed to help individuals learn English. Over 40 states recognize now the need for interpreters in judicial settings and have joined the National Center for State Boards, an organization which provides certification exams for interpreters in the federal and state judiciary. These federal standards set a set of basic rights that states can expand, but theoretically not diminish or circumvent, risking legal action and loss of funding if they do so. It is important to note that most states recognize this mandate and have taken steps to ensure its implementation, but not all the states. Not all the states are in compliance with this executive order, and Arizona is among them. In my opinion, linguistic access belongs to a venerable lineage of basic rights, like habeas corpus or the right to free speech, for which we have fought very hard for a very long time to prevent abuse and guarantee access to justice. For people who speak a language other than English, there is no access or meaningful participation without linguistic participation. The Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court is most eloquent in a recently released video about interpreters in the Ohio courts that I would like to play for you.
growing diversity of our state presents new challenges to the legal system. Judges, lawyers, jurors, clerks, and bailiffs today hear languages such as Wolof, Farsi, and Punjabi, languages and dialects that were rarely heard in Ohio, even a few years ago. Today, 73 languages are spoken in Ohio courts. One court administrator said we are witnessing an explosion of people coming before the courts who do not speak English. All persons, regardless of their language skills, have the same constitutional protections of due process. The United States and Ohio constitutions extend protections to persons accused of committing a crime. The accused must be able to understand the charges and be able to participate in their defense. This right is weakened when the defendant does not speak English or does not speak it well enough to understand the proceedings, raising fundamental questions regarding the fairness of the proceedings and the integrity of the fact-finding process. A language interpreter helps ensure a defendant is able to fully participate in his or her defense and to confer with counsel.
What the good judge is saying, this good judge from Ohio, it also applies to Arizona. How we respond and our willingness to make reasonable efforts to facilitate understanding and participation and provide reliable, qualified language services to make access possible, protect our beloved constitutional rights, raises fundamental questions related to ethical behavior and integrity. In this era, characterized by diversity, mobility, proximity, in a historical moment in which the changing demographics are reshaping the cultural fabric of modern societies, we need to renew our efforts for compliance to make the provision of access a societal priority from a legal and ethical perspective. We just can't afford the tremendous human, social, and financial costs contingent to failure to provide access. And consider for 1 second the cost of alienation and stress that lack of access to employment, to education, to healthcare, and justice brings to people with limited English proficiency. Consider the cost of malpractice lawsuits or civil rights lawsuits. Consider the cost in public health issues, especially with transnational communities like ours, where the need for translators and interpreter services to contain the spread of disease, especially during epidemics and pandemics, is just fundamental. The provision of access and language services makes social sense, no question about it, but it can also be a sound financial measure. And let me give you a local example. There is one hospital in Tucson, just one, that has implemented a professional service of translators and interpreters. This has attracted a large number of Spanish-speaking patients, both from the metropolitan area, from the state, from neighboring states, and also from Mexico. And this service posting substantial profits in that area, generated by Spanish-speaking Latino users. So it can be done, and it can be done with profit. I would like to say some words about professional ethics as well. So that is my ethical dilemmas when I practiced as a translator and as an interpreter. Because when I provide translation and interpretation services, I am providing a service. We are hired by a client for a specific task, and this contractual agreement implies certain expectations and loyalties. But like in many other professions, it has not only a professional agreement or a contractual agreement, because our work has social implications. And this interaction oftentimes is fraught with ethical dilemmas and potentially conflictive situations. We oftentimes practice within institutional settings in which we are representatives of those institutions, the representatives of power, and must comply with the institutional values and standards that sometimes can be questioned. We also operate according to different underlying ethical premises. Beneficence-based models guide the medical professions. The well-being of the patient is the ultimate goal of all the participants in a clinical encounter. Not so in an adversarial, litigation-based setting like the one that is the model for legal litigation. There, for us, the priority for the interpreter, the translator, is to preserve impartiality and to avoid any impression of bias at all costs. Medical and legal translators and interpreters deal with difficult situations constantly, matters of life and death, loss of freedom, mental competency, disability, legal custody of children, domestic violence, insurance coverage, immigration status, all charged topics that require the utmost ethical behavior and professional fortitude. All these have to be reconciled with personal values, and translators and interpreters have to decide which ones take preference in a particular setting or encounter. This is one graphic that we use in our classes here at the University of Arizona that I think that is very useful to understand the multiple roles that interpreters and translators play and the interaction of those roles. If you look at this pyramid, you will see that interpreters are first and foremost content, a means. But interpreters and translators also can work as clarifiers, and if necessary as cultural brokers, and in some instances also as advocates when violations of fundamental rights, people occur, and then, as a professional, as a member of this society, you feel compelled to intervene too. This is called a model of progressive intervention, and gives a good idea, as I said, of the multiple roles of translators and interpreters have to fulfill. The appropriate role for a translator and an interpreter is the role that will afford the best possible communication with the less intrusive. And the higher we go in this pyramid, the most intrusive you become as a translator and interpreter. So those are things that a practitioner has to keep in mind and check in balance. Another important aspect to consider is how translators and interpreters relieve providers from guessing what's going on. There are providers that speak more than one language, but the level of accuracy and completeness and precision that you need when you are interpreting in a medical encounter or in a legal encounter well surpasses this capability. And for bilingual providers, it also relieves them of the burden of having to act with wearing two hats, that of course cultural communicator and that of provider. I want my doctor to be able, or my nurse, or my attorney to be able to fully concentrate on the matter at hand, for which these individuals are professionally qualified. And to make things even more complicated, translators and interpreters also have to take into consideration the ethical dilemmas inherent in the relationship with the author, the text, and the audience, and the related loyalty conflicts that Jesus so eloquently has explained before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip this part, which has been masterly covered by my colleague, and I want to say some words about the ethical consideration as an educator, as a professor and a director of the program of translation and interpretation here at the University of Arizona regarding bilingual education and the merits of translation and interpretation as academic disciplines. Because this ethically is very important for me too, both as a professional, as an educator, and as a member of this community. I do believe in the merits of the additive model of bilingual education, which values and develops the primary language and acquires a second or a third language, instead of supplanting the primary language with one language only policies. There is no question in my mind that the revalorization of bilingual education is conspicuously absent from instructional materials in language curricula, which does not make sense in a society that is becoming more cosmopolitan and multilingual. Also, empirical reports from the job market demonstrate that these are sound principles. Employers prioritize professionals who can function in more than one language and culture. According to the US Labor Department Occupational Outlook, you have a short summary there on the screen, interpreters and translators can expect much faster than average employment growth over the next decade. I bet these are good news for my students. Any seniors that are graduating this semester, go and get them. This growth will be driven partly by strong demand in healthcare settings and work related to homeland security and law enforcement, which are specialties we included in our curriculum. finalize, I would like to say that it's my belief that the quality of decisions and actions taken in our society at large, in public health, healthcare, education, in our criminal and civil courts, is to a large extent dependent on accurate communication. The landscape of the 21st century, while still unfolding, includes an increasingly diverse, rapidly expanding, limited and non-English speaking population in the United States, to which we have to pay attention. The increased recognition of access for limited and non-English speakers as a right, a heightened interconnectivity between different facets of society, as well as between societies as a result of globalization, and market demands that place a premium and value cross-cultural fluency. In our multicultural and multilingual society, there is a clear, urgent need for translators and interpreters in all aspects of civic life, public and private, to bridge the cultural divide while protecting fundamental rights. This can no longer be seen as a convenience or a privilege. Those working in executive positions in the public and private sectors must guarantee, facilitate, and protect quality linguistic access and cross-cultural services, and provide administrative and financial resources to accommodate translators and interpreters. We, as educators and leaders in the language service field, must also define and promote linguistic and cross-cultural education and work to further this recognition and professionalization. We need to prepare translators and interpreters as skilled professionals who can facilitate communication and act as cultural brokers, well-versed in a broad array of content areas, who deserve commensurate compensation and status recognition, and who can contribute to the implementation of the ethical and professional standards that govern the provision of access. The development of comprehensive national standards and practical applied programs within higher education is but just one step towards this lofty goal. And that's all. Thank you very much right now for everything. Thank you very much. What I would like to do right now is to invite to the podium to our distinguished guest, Professor Zelda Harris, who is a clinical professor at the College of Law and also teaches ethics. She's the director of the Domestic Violence Clinic. And Dr. Francisco Moreno, a doctor in psychiatry, who has been kind. These individuals work very hard, they are very busy, and we appreciate tremendously your time here with us. So if you don't mind, if you want to just share some of your experiences with the audience, that would be terrific.
Okay, sure. Can I?
Please.
I like to. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Do y'all need to stretch your legs or anything? Please do that. And as you're doing that, I guess I'd like to know how many of you have had any experiences with lawyers? Anyone? Just by raising hand. Was it happy, pleasant experience? Usually when you're coming to my office, it's not. I'm the director of something called the Domestic Violence Law Clinic, which is now the Child and Family Law Clinic. And so most of our clients are in crisis, and most people's experiences with law and lawyers and the court is a circumstance of crisis. I mean, it's great if that's not the case, but typically that is the circumstance. And that's important to know, because I'd like to talk about how people enter the system, like what happens before you get to the courtroom, right? Because yes, the federal law definitely applies to what the obligation of the courts are to provide interpreters. But what's the obligation of the attorney, before the case ever comes before the court? We rely on interpreters in the clinic program. And in fact, for the last 3 years, we've worked alongside Professor Fataz and his students in the language and interpretation program to provide Spanish language interpretation and translation services. And these are some of the students here who have done an incredible job for us over this current semester. And that's critical because although some of our law students, these are law student attorneys who are in training, speak Spanish, they're learning too. So this is a multidisciplinary environment where they're learning not only the law and how to interact with the client, but how to work with interpreters. And it's a double interpretation. What do I mean by that? I mean, the law is a language all in and of itself. So when the law students come to law school, they're learning an entire new language. You know, what is a warrant? What's an order to show cause? What's a rebuttable presumption? You know, what's a subpoena? I mean, these are all words and texts that we don't usually use in everyday life, right? So the law student attorney has a challenge of breaking down that language so that the interpreter can interpret that language in the client's native language, right? So we have a double layer of interpretation that is going on. Now, lawyers have an ethical obligation to communicate with their clients. The American Bar Association puts out a host of rules talking about the ethical obligations of lawyers. And the rule regarding communication with clients is that you have to communicate with your clients, you have to inform them, but the rule doesn't give you any guidance on, well, what if your client doesn't speak Spanish, or speak English rather, right? So that's really left up, it's implied that you've got to figure out a way to manage that situation, but there's no real guidance in the rule itself. And so that's where some of the gaps come in, right? Because in our community, what do you think the top 5 languages are of clients that come into a lawyer's office other than English? Anyone? Okay, absolutely. But what do you think the other 4 are after that?
Russian.
Who said Russian? Did someone say Russian? Russian. I was surprised by that. I found this out by looking through our Tucson City Court puts out a report on numbers of hours billed by interpreters. Russian is number 2. What do you think number 3 is? It comes in more like at number 4. That's Cantonese and... Well, I have French. It's who knows what? I'm sorry, Vietnamese. I should have said Vietnamese was number 2. Russian is number 3, and who knows what Dinka is?
Sudan.
Say that.
It's from Sudan.
From the Sudan. That makes sense, right? We have a Sudanese community here in Tucson, and number 5 is Arabic, and after that followed by Farsi. I have some of these out here as handouts if you'd like to see them, but that means that lawyers who don't speak these languages need to figure out how are we going to get interpreters to help us, because otherwise we're not going to be able to help the client. And there's no obligation on attorneys to take clients that speak a language other than English, and that you need to understand too. There's no obligation on lawyers to do that. So if you can't communicate, then you shouldn't be accepting the client for representation. So what does that mean? People go without, right? People go without legal representation. That's particularly true in the civil context. The law that Professor Fatas spoke of and the judge on the video, they were talking about criminal law. Now, in the criminal context, yes, you have to be appointed a lawyer, and that lawyer has to either speak your language or you'll get an interpreter. But in the civil context, and that means things like divorces, child custody, child support, these are things that we deal with in the clinic. There's no mandatory requirement that you get appointed a lawyer or a lawyer that speaks your language or an interpreter that speaks your language. And so there's a huge gap in the system that way. So I guess what I would really want to impress upon you is that we have laws, but it's hard to implement it at the ground level because there's so much that goes on before you get into the courtroom. One of the examples Professor Fatas asked me to talk about, some of the problems that we've encountered, is police reports. So even in the criminal context, although the client may have a right to a particular language interpreter in court, well, before you get into the courtroom, you might like to know what you're charged with, or you might like to have an idea as to what the law enforcement officers are saying about you. Police reports are written in English. There's no requirement that the police report that basically builds the case for the state be in any language other than English. So we've had our interpreter staff, through Professor Fatah's direction, interpreting police reports from English into Spanish so that people can aid in their own defense. Another example are pro se litigants, people representing themselves in family court. Again, there's just a universal lack of legal services, and so people go to the courthouse, fill out paperwork to try to represent themselves. The law says that vital paperwork has to be available in other languages, but there's so much paperwork that's involved. If anyone has ever gone through the divorce process, you know that the level of paperwork is just huge. And so people have to try to figure that out. The laws are not written in a language other than English. The forms, some are translated into Spanish, many are not translated into those other languages that we've talked about. And so it's a real challenge for the court to deal with pro se litigants. And so what people do is they rely on family and friends. And although that gets you through the process, your rights and what you're entitled to could be limited, right? Because you all are more than aware of the challenges that occur when confidential, private, sensitive information is trying to be flowed through friends and family. So I just wanted to give you some of those examples. I know I'm not here to speak for too long, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them about the work that we do at the clinic. I do want to say briefly that we have also an immigration law clinic at the law school in addition to our child and family law clinic, and we have an Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy clinic. We are all very aware of the issues of interpretation and the access to justice issues, and we try our hardest to make sure that our clients have full access when they come to our office as well as when they get into the courtroom. Thank you.
Very interesting. I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Can I get a translator if I only speak English? Used to be told what all those big words mean.
Yeah.
Do people? Yeah. Okay. Never mind.
Dr. Moreno, yes, you can. There are a number of highly qualified translators sitting there, so feel free to ask any legal questions that you have in mind, because I'm sure they will.
Good. So, I'm a psychiatrist, and I work here at UMC. I do research part of my time, and I do teaching another part of my time, and I do clinical work another part of my time. And so what I wanted to share with you today is just maybe take a little bit of time and highlight the importance of accurate translation for the clinical setting, for the research setting, for medicine, and for psychiatry as well. So, a couple of important things. I started my residency here in 1992, and there were not a whole lot of people that spoke Spanish in the medical teams. But we had a lot of people that helped clean the floors that spoke Spanish. And that's a lot of what we did at the emergency room and in the different services. So if somebody spoke Spanish and we couldn't understand what they were saying, well, we'd just call Jose or whoever was cleaning the floor, say, come on over. And we've come a long way since then. We've come a long ways from times where we used to kind of just take advantage of whatever resources we have that were not ideal. Because many times you don't want to use family. You might want to be okay with somebody in the room for certain illnesses or for certain checkups, but you might not want to have certain people there in the room when you're talking about certain topics. And that's very true in some areas of medicine, including infectious disease and just general health, GYN, psychiatry, the D. We we spend a lot of time training our residents and medical students to ask questions in a sensitive way. We talk about very delicate issues, things like suicide, things like homicide, things like trauma, physical, emotional, sexual forms of trauma. And so when people come in, you go and approach them, we always tell people, you just don't go and slam it in the door and say, have you ever been X, Y, Z? Or are you having thoughts of committing suicide right now? So, you kind of have to build it up, you work around it, and you find over time elegant ways of sort of approaching these questions and building up the intensity and whatnot. You're kind of borrowing permission as you're building on to the harder question for patients. And sometimes when you don't have ideal interpretation, folks, that left the mob on the side to come and help the guy that is trying to ask the question, instead of saying something like, have you been having thoughts of harming yourself, will say something like, you don't want to kill yourself, do you? Or, and these are, very sad, funny, but kind of true stories. And this is part of what we find too much of the time. So for us, it's become a really nice benefit to see that we have a lot more translation support at the hospital, but also that we have a lot of people that are really interested in learning a number of other languages. And it is true that if somebody comes in and they can speak another language, then it is really a lot more attractive as part of search committees and as part of recruitment committees for residency program and otherwise. We want to serve the population that we have here in a linguistically and also culturally sort of intuitive what's the word that I'm looking for? Come on. You want people to be comfortable with some similarities sometimes with the folks that you are also helping treat. So, a couple of other examples that have to do with that is as part of our research. We are doing some ways of doing outreach for immigrants that are coming into our country. We're providing video conference-based telepsychiatry as a way of bringing people that are a little bit more culturally and linguistically compatible with the patients that we are serving so much of the time. So that could be another way of at times helping up narrow that gap and help provide services to the people that are just largely underserved, because we don't have availability of people that would really understand a lot of what's going on. Another example that I wanted to talk about is we help write a sexual scale to look at some of the medicines we use in psychiatry give sexual dysfunction of different kinds. And so this scale became an international thing. And so after about a year and a half, it was translated to 17 different languages. And now we have, more than 70 different translations. And what was funny about it is that two of us, I'm from Mexico, and then there was another guy from Cuba that helped write the scale. And now we have 5 Spanish versions. And what we were talking about from our own Spanish version of Spanish didn't make a whole lot of sense to people in northern Argentina and some of the folks in Spain and some of the folks in other countries. So we found that we had to translate it and use sometimes different words. But also there were some countries in which the word orgasm wasn't, you couldn't really say it. There you go, orgasm. And so we have to find different ways of kind of like the legal words, describing what it is, or using words that were completely non-sexual as a way of sort of talking to people about that. So, these illustrations, I think, to me, just mean a whole lot in terms of the importance of culturally, traditionally, and just linguistically being able to be loyal to what the practitioner is trying to provide, and to make sure that we are not bringing in our own thing. The other thing is sometimes you see, and this is something we always joke about, that people start hitting it off and start talking, and then you ask a question, how old are you? And then you hear people yakking away like, and then back and forth, and they like 3 minutes go by, and then they say 27. So, we really want to know everything that goes on, and we really want to make sure that whatever we are passing on is being passed on as loyally as possible. Also in medicine and psychiatry, and there's a lot of those things that we don't want those relatives to know in the room or the other people. The issues of confidentiality and health information protection are just a huge deal for us. And in psychiatry, we really see that as like it's almost like we're the confessors. For those of you that may know the Catholic culture and other folks that may do confession as well, this is a big deal. And so having the real privilege to be involved in these kinds of translations and other clinical services, I think, just brings that big responsibility of making sure that we're not going to be passing it on and just this whole idea of confidentiality or whatnot. So I'm sure you guys probably have lectures about all these things. I just wanted to share with you a few examples of things that I've encountered.
Well, we still have 5 minutes if anyone has any questions or any comments, or if you want to share any of your experiences, please.
There's some of us here that go to FEMA college. Can we go and visit the clinic and stuff?
The domestic violence clinic.
Yes.
Well, that's something that I will discuss with Professor Harris. Is the nature of the encounter is confidential. But perhaps we can find some time to visit, talk to some of the law students, Professor Harris, to our students get together and do something together.
I guess my question is it only for U of A students that can go over there, or?
It's not only for U of A students, but for senior students in the program that have proven their proficiency and their moral resiliency, because it's not easy to interpret in domestic violence encounters. It's very taxing emotionally, linguistically too, so you really have to have your act together. But we will explore that. If you are so kind, please just, when we are through, wait a minute, I'll give you my card, you can send me an email and we will hook. By the way, Mildred teaches,
Yes.
Is she here?
So
Yes.
my teacher.
Hey, hello, how are you doing? I saw you before, but I didn't say anything. Thank you very much for coming. We are almost out of time, but we still can take a couple of questions, and then there is a couple of things that I want to say before closing. Anyone else? No? Okay, well, what I want to say is that, as Professor Harris has mentioned, and as Professor Moreno too, there is a great need for the provision of translation and interpretation services. We've been through the phenomenal and altruistic work of many of the students in the program. For the last 2.5 years, we've implemented 9 practicums that serve the community. We have practicums with the Superior Court, with Juvenile Court, with the Domestic Violence Clinic, with Southern Arizona Legal Aid, with the Family Unit, with the Immigration Unit, with the bilingual newspaper, the only bilingual newspaper that is published in South Tucson. And our students really, when they reach a level of proficiency where they can work as interpreters, because many of these assignments are very difficult and very challenging, have been stepping to the plate and providing phenomenal services to the community and to professionals who provide these services, the doctors, the attorneys that need to communicate with the patients, but also to segments of the population that have limited English proficiency and no means really to afford professional communication or professional translators and interpreters. I really would like to call for an applause for many of those students who are here present, who have been providing those services. And I think that's a shining example of how the humanities really can save lives
and interact with any other fields in the sciences, in technical professions, in order to work together to bring understanding, comfort, relief, and justice to people of all languages, races, ethnicities, creeds, religious orientation, and races. Thank you very much for coming.